Yes, there is something more, and it's everything. You know, Mick is shaking his cute little butt on stage in some white pants and football pads, and it's sort of this extreme vision of what rock and roll can be and what it's evolved into. You know, the pageantry and the showmanship has evolved past that grit and revolution of the 60s and is something that's pretty commercial at this point, but not necessarily in a bad way, and I think that that's a really interesting tension. What's up, everybody? My name is Fred, and I'm a singer-songwriter based out of New York City. I perform music in the streets to people I've never met before. So I'm super interested in live performance, what makes a good performance, and diving into amazing performances from the past to see if there's anything that we can glean for our own personal practices. So, we're taking it back to the 1980s, taking it back to the Rolling Stones on their 1981 tour of the United States. And we're going to take a look at the video, and then we're going to go through and add some context and sort of point out some of the things that stand out. So, let's do it. Backstage view, here we go. Mick looking like a football player. Look at those shoulders. Balloons. Rock and roll, what a song. Awesome. Cool, so let's dive into it. First and foremost, who are the Rolling Stones? Everybody's familiar with them, but just a quick review for, for the people in the back. Formed in the early 60s in London, heavily inspired by blues and rock and roll music from the United States, and of course a famous part of the British invasion that also included the Beatles, bands such as the Kinks, the Animals, Jerry and the Pacemakers, groups like that took that rock and roll sound, that grittier sound, put a British spin on it, and sent it back to the United States at a time where countercultural movements, protests, civil rights protests, protests against the Vietnam War, all combined to create a counterculture to the largely uniform and, referred to as the quiet generation of the 50s. So a lot of disruption happening in the 1960s. We talked about that a little bit in the Beatles video that we did earlier. But we are no longer in the 60s. We're in the 1980s. A lot of that huge change in the 60s and all that revolution gave way to a little bit of malaise and a bit of a hangover in the 70s. Some great music from that time, but that sort of evolved into this early 80s moment where the cultural trends, and we saw this with the Talking Heads videos, suburban lifestyle is really well defined. People are growing up, following defined career paths, perhaps in the shoes of their mother and father. And there's a little bit of an existential question. And again, when we go back to somebody like David Byrne, he's very much positioning the monotony of day-to-day life against this question of, is there something more? Well, the Rolling Stones give a really great answer to that question, which, yes, there is something more, and it's everything. Mick has shaking his cute little butt on stage in some white pants and football pads in front of this, lovely designed, colorful stage. And it's sort of this extreme vision of what rock and roll can be and what it's evolved into. The pageantry and the showmanship has evolved past that grit and revolution of the 60s and is something that's pretty commercial at this point, but not necessarily in a bad way, and I think that that's a really interesting tension. We look at this tour, in the early 80s, 1981, very high-grossing tour, especially for the time. $50 million it brought in, at the top of records, at the point that they were really first starting to keep track of it. But also particular elements like a daytime show and really brightly colored designs and all the balloons and the spectacle of all that. But they also employed some innovative approaches to things such as selling advertising space on the ticket stubs, something you see done across the board in this day and age. But at that point in time, this was one of the first shows to really employ that kind of revenue generation tactic. We also look at things like the Hampton, Virginia show from this tour. They did the first pay-per-view showing of a concert. It was Keith Richards' birthday, and they, sold the rights to view that from a pay-per-view standpoint. Again, a really common model for something like Nugs or some of those platforms that, that sell the rights to live shows now, to view live shows now, but really innovative for the time. And it speaks to the cultural machine that the Rolling Stones had built, again, 15, 20 years later, where they, they're an established act. Look at the size of these venues. They're selling out arenas all across the United States. This is by no means their first tour. They're touring again. They're playing these favorite songs, Under My Thumb, a song from the early 60s or mid 60s. And it's all combining to a very different version of the rock and roll lifestyle and presentation than we would have seen from certainly the Beatles in 1964. But even through the hippies phase and then through into the 70s and the 80s, all of that has gone through quite a bit of evolution. To now we're at the point where we've got the shoulder pads and it's about excess and it's the television age. MTV is starting to come around. They're starting to have music and its portrayal on video be an enormous part of how bands are gaining distribution. And so that's another piece of recording this concert video, is the Stones are being very, very intentional about how they're positioning themselves in the cultural movement in terms of the tradition of rock and roll. And so we're going to go back through the video and dive into that a little bit here. But I wanted to take a step out and just say that it's been really great to see a lot of the comments that people have put on some of these videos, these reaction videos, especially the Beatles video. I love that people are picking apart different aspects of that video and sharing both their personal experience, but also facts that they find really interesting. So please do that. Please, if there's something you see from this video that you think I didn't cover or that's worth diving into further, please put it in the comments section. If there's a correction that's needed, put it down there. That's a lot of fun to have too. And let's get into the video and see some of the specific things, especially performance and presentation wise, that I think that the Stones did really well here. So we'll kick it off at the beginning. What up, Nick? Skip ahead just a little bit here. Right. Riff kicks off before they're even out there. Balloons. What's the first thing that happens? Mick starts shaking his butt. And I love that. Again, this is the same shot that we had at first, but the thought of an entire stadium of people, the anticipation, they're waiting, they've been waiting so long. This tour date has been circled on their calendar for months. And the Rolling Stones are showing up in town, and they're playing a show, and they're waiting and they're waiting and they're waiting, and all of a sudden the riff starts, the curtains part, and here's Mick Jagger in a football top, football pants, shaking his butt to the crowd. He's delivering on the promise of a Rolling Stones show right off the bat. He's playing his part, he's connecting with the crowd, pumping up the energy, getting everybody engaged right off the bat. That's what you need in a stadium show, from the beginning to the end. And now we see this, we bring up somebody like Taylor Swift or Beyonce. Now it's down to a science that every second is engineered. And my goodness, the K-pop stars. If you haven't watched a K-pop performance or a music video, everything's so perfectly choreographed. And it comes out of this tradition of a rock and roll show of this size. This was as big as it got, at the time, the Rolling Stones doing a tour like this. So how do you deliver on that? Well, especially with Mick and Keith and their interplay, we'll see over the course of this 3-minute video how something like that comes together. And then another thing here, just right off the bat at the very beginning, something that they're doing that's really intelligent, that especially if you're a performer yourself, I'd urge you to find a way to incorporate this into your approach, is that, they're playing a hit. They're playing a song that's 15 years old at this point. And so, again, delivering on the promise of the Rolling Stones. I mean, starting with the hits, finishing with the hits, start on a high note, finish on a high note. That's all classic performance theory. But I think what they do that's really smart here is they settle into the groove, and they just let the groove carry them for about 30 seconds or so of just, letting everybody feel that moment and letting the moment breathe. And we're at the show. It's finally here. Here they are on stage. Mick's doing his thing. The rest of the band's doing their thing. It's all coming together in that regard. And just taking that little bit of a pause to give people that moment where they can process everything that's going on is a really grounding way to start a show. That it really sets the tone well for the rest of the performance, to just give that little space to breathe. As a performer, you settle into what you're doing. Maybe you're nervous, maybe it's a bigger crowd than you're used to. How do you get yourself in that groove, in that headspace? Play something you're really comfortable with, that feels really good to play. Take a big deep breath and prepare yourself for the rest of the show. Very, very professional how they've set that up for themselves. And Mick's running all over the place. He's getting the entire crowd engaged. Awesome. So I'm going to move it forward a little bit better. Again, we can go and we can watch the whole thing again, but I want to find a couple of spots here that are really engaging. This one here, and I really love this for the composition, and we'll let this part play out a little bit, but there are a couple things that I really want to point out. First off, if you ever want to present as a rock and roller, if you want to ever, dress and carry yourself in the rock and roll style, there is no better model than Keith Richards in this video. He's got a cigarette dangled out of his mouth, the leather jacket, the skinny tie, the boots, to contrast with Mick, who is so engaged with the crowd and, working the entire stage, working the entire stadium, Keith is just standing there doing his thing. I think that that's a really great model, especially, I'm more introverted, especially in my performances. I really like to let the performance speak for itself. You have to create the connection with the crowd, and Mick is doing that work here. But also at the same time, you're performing, it's your practice. You're allowed to be a little bit more reserved if that's how you feel, or to focus on the music. People will connect with you if you give them that bridge too, and then it's up to you to develop that emotional connection in whichever way you see fit. And so Mick and Keith are really great contrasts in that regard. That's just, that's what's going on there from a balance perspective and from a persona perspective. The other thing that I really want to point out about this shot in particular, and this gets back to the video aspect, and especially if you're a performer, you're trying to capture content, you're trying to turn that into something that you can then use to promote yourself later. I really want to focus on the composition of this shot as something that was planned, for this concert movie. And the Stones are professionals. They know that there are going to be cameras out there. Their first priority is going to be the crowd, of course, but they also know how to find the cameras. They know when the camera's on them, and they know when to rise to that occasion. And one of the things that I love about this is the amount of balance that's created in these couple of early shots in terms of framing the band against the crowd, against the stage, and against one another. The stage is really intelligent. There's little levels to it. These tiny little inclines and corners create visual interest. They draw the eye. And when you think of Mick Jagger running all the way around all across the stage, drawing the eye, and then, whoa, that's a little overwhelming, so you settle in on something and you've got the band behind him absolutely rocking out. The whole setting is tuned to create that experience for both the live audience member, but also the viewer of the video after the fact. That's a very deep layer, level of planning for this type of performance, but that's what you get when you're one of the biggest bands in the world at a peak of your career, is the opportunity to think at that integrated level between what is the performance like, what is the stage like, what is the video capture going to be like. And if you can start to integrate all of these different factors at a really basic level, then when we start to promote, we start to go on Instagram, we start to go on these other platforms, you're presenting a coherent image of yourself, and that's the type of thing that people can really buy into emotionally. From a marketing perspective, we'd refer to that as your brand. You're building a coherent brand, and all of the little pieces of what you're doing tie back into that. We're going to move it forward a little bit. Again, we've got more great composition. Again, the composition of the shot is excellent. The balance between the foreground and background, and also where they're placed in the set, is really intentional. But I'm going to let it play in a second, and I want you to really focus again on Mick. Focus on how he uses his facial expressions. Again, we go back to David Byrne, and we look at him as somebody who presented very normally, very neutral colors, and then uses facial expressions and his accents to exaggerate and present this sort of tension against the normal day-to-day life, suburban life that he's trying to parody to some degree. What Mick is doing here is almost the opposite, where he's still doing the exaggerated movements, but he's taking it out there and saying, listen, babe, this is rock and roll. We're as out there as it can get. No reason to hold back. And when you're performing to a crowd of this size, we've said this before, if you're in an intimate setting, minor subtle differences are going to really tell the story, but that's not going to work on a stage of this size. And so look at how exaggerated his facial expressions. Look how he tells the story of the music in little twitches that he does that are intentionally tailored to support the story that he's trying to tell with this music. So I'm going to let it play out from here, but that's what I really want you to focus on. Mick's version of himself, the character that he plays, that plays to the audience so well, and then also contrast that against Keith Richards here, who's just the epitome of rock and roll in his own right as well. Guitar solo. That power stance. It's like School of Rock. They talk about the power stance. That's it. Like you can see what he's doing from far away. They're kicking the balloons around on stage. Sweet. Awesome. Well, that's Under My Thumb by the Rolling Stones. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Again, if you have some thoughts about this, leave them down in the comment section. I'll be down there. I try to reply to just about everything. And that's it for this video. We'll catch you with the next one. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later. Peace.